Yeah.
Welcome, folks. This is House Corrections and Institutions Committee. It is Thursday, March 20th. We are meeting around 8:30 this morning. Again, we're running a little late. We're going to be discussing what we call the 3Bs. Was the administration proposed about 3.1 million to go to 3 individual projects in 3 different communities. These are private entities that are going to be developing, doing some development where some of it will be for affordable housing. They've looked at the capital bill for funding, and we had concerns with that about opening up the capital bill for a lot of other projects. And we had a little subgroup of 4 people from the committee working on this. And we have come to the decision as a committee on from some recommendation from that little group, as well as some language, which we haven't resolved the language yet. But we have moved, instead of 3.1, we've put in 2 million. We moved that to cash. And then we want to move that to subaccount B in appropriations. There's subaccount B, which goes for other infrastructure. And we have accounted for that 2 million within our budgeting process to track to go with those projects so that appropriations committee does not have to find the 2 million. So we want to make it hold appropriations committee harmless. So there is language that is being proposed by the subgroup. And this is the first time that we've really gone through the language. It's on page 29, it's section 25. It's basically the use of the funds and also what needs to be put in place where the funds are released. So we have the administration here. We have Commissioner Farrell from the Department of Housing and Community Development. And you sent us a letter yesterday, and that was sent to all of us. And I'm assuming it's been posted on our webpage. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Given that I'm only with you for about 15 minutes here, I can be as succinct as possible. So, just obligated to say that the administration doesn't support the reduction from 3.1 to 2, and also we'd recommend that these 3 projects be funded and then this grant program be established going forward for future years. So I'll start there on the record, and then now I can dive into the areas within the language that I think are areas of concern for us.
I zoned out a little bit because I was looking for your letter. When you said going forward, what were you referring to?
If there are future housing funding through the capital bill.
And you would support that?
Well, sure. I have no philosophical objection to going forward using a grant program like this to fund housing projects.
You realize how much pressure that's going to put on the capital bill?
Sure.
I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm just a little stunned to hear that because we only have 100 million bonding capacity for 2 years. And we have a lot of pressures out there with municipalities for their water and sewer. We have pressures from our agencies, Forest and Parks, Fish and Wildlife, Clean Water, and also we're looking at building a correctional facility replacement. So there's a lot of pressure. And
maybe I can, in my statement, what I meant, Madam Chair, is it seems the will of this committee is if there ever comes a request for housing through the capital bill again, it not be direct, it go through a grant program. I'm just saying that's fine.
Yeah, a grant program. The question is, how do you fund the grant program?
Let Nick answer that. And looking at the language, the program design, I can point to a couple areas that I think the language could use some tweaking. I checked this with some other folks in the housing space that have programs that are funded by various dollars in the legislature, just to make sure that I wasn't out of step here. So I chatted with Gus at VHCB. I've chatted with folks at VHFA, just to make sure that this feedback is reasonable. So I'm looking over at page 32, lines 10 and 11. So one of the requirements would be that.
Page what?
You're probably on an older.
You know what? I am on an old draft. So I'm in section 25.
Yeah. You got that, section 25.
Okay.
Is it first, is it A, B, C?
Yep. So it's going to be C 5.
5, so that's page 30. Line 10.
And this is where program requirements are laid out. And so in effect, what you've all done here is you've put together a list of sort of basic structures, the way this program should look, and then, as usually happens, deferring to the department to actually design and administer the program. One of these requirements, 5, would require that these funds go to projects with permanently affordable housing. That is a pretty strict standard in the housing space. Of the projects that you heard from, the only one that would check that box, for example, would be Ben High. Neither of the other projects, as of now, have perpetually affordable housing in them. So that's a pretty high bar. We also do substantially fund as a state, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which they're the experts in permanently affordable housing. It's a really complicated thing to administer, and I trust Gus and Polly to administer that. They know what they're doing. With funding like this, I think it would be too restrictive to narrow it that much. What I would say is affordability ought to be taken into account in the application process, and that almost always is the case with our programs. We have some aspect of program design that you get some benefit if there's some affordability component, or if you've accounted for that in your housing needs assessment and the project matches that.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I just wonder if there's any questions on this piece at this point.
Understanding the point.
No, that's clear, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to move down now. So still in section 25, and I'm going to go down to F. And this is just sort of a check back mechanism, a reporting requirement. Especially if this is intended to be a sort of a one-time investment, which I'm hearing is maybe the will of the committee. This is a one-time thing, and this is the mechanism to do it. This requirement for ACCD to come and check back before actually granting any of the funds would delay. So under the governor's recommend, ideally, once the capital bill is the funding is transferred to us, we could immediately move funding to the municipality. So we'd be looking at a July timeline under sort of the governor's recommend. With this check back mechanism, with sort of running through with both committees, the program design and getting their sign off before awards can be made, we'd be looking at spring of 2026 before these awards could be made. So there'd be a pretty substantial delay. It's also just not traditional. Generally speaking, the way it would happen, sort of a program design would be an exchange. You all put the parameters that you want to make sure that we account for, and then the department is sort of given the authority to administer the program within statute laid out, rather than design it, come back, and then make awards.
What we do in the capital world, which I know you haven't worked in our,
Right.
you haven't been over the years. What we tend to do in this world is when there is money to go out for a certain project or anything, quite often what we do is, like, let's say the RFPs come back for a particular project, and we just weren't sure how it was going to really play out. We would put in language from time to time that the commissioner would have to check in
Sure.
with the committee before taking the next step. It's not to say we're involved in the RFP or anything. It's just the scope, to understand the scope, because there could have been different options maybe going forward. So what we quite often do is have a check back sometimes. And it would be usually it would be to the chairs of the two respective committees. It doesn't mean it's going to stop it. It's just a check-in. We do that quite often in this world.
Sure.
It's just you haven't been exposed to it because you haven't been in the committee much, because you haven't had projects so much in the committee. And so that's where this comes from. And I understand what you're saying about having the committee, because standing committees have no ability to take action when we're off session. So, and again, this is the first time the committee's gone through this language.
Sure. So
It was recommended by the four folks who are working on that subgroup.
Well, and what I'd offer to maybe achieve that would be rather than the language that says prior to the award of any grant, maybe make it more flexible and rather than refer to the committees, perhaps refer to the chairs
Now,
and enable us to still move forward with the awards.
I understand what you're saying about having the whole committee weigh in, because
Mhm.
that's hard to do during the summer and fall. We would have no authority as a standing committee to act off session.
That'd be our concern. That was my feedback.
Have you read the rest of the language? It's been before us?
I only read section 25.
Right, that's what I meant.
Yes, yes.
And for the rest of the language, are you supportive of that?
The rest of the language, I think, largely aligns with our internal criteria that were used. So I don't see where the rest of this would be an issue. Aside from just to revert back to sort of my have an obligation to state that our preference would not be to run these first grants through a grant program, but rather direct grants. But other than that, yes, the criteria that I see aside from those two that I flagged seem in line with how we pick these internally. Perhaps missing our focus on flood-prone communities, but we could include that in program design. That's fine.
What's the rationale for preferring not to start with a grant program?
Time. Yes.
Going
That's a good
back to,
question.
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
Go ahead, Joe.
going back to section C, which specifically C, division 5 on the middle line 10 of 32. That section number 5 is the only one that you find to be objectionable.
The affordable housing, Joe?
Yes.
Is that, yeah?
Yes, and specifically the term permanently affordable housing.
Permanently.
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, sometimes there are different ways to approach this. You could peg it to a certain AMI. You could peg it to there is an affordable housing definition in there. My view of these funds would be to leave it more general because the housing focused funds that are going to be in these projects are going to have all those requirements already. This is intended to be sort of a layer on top of those. So, for example, Ben High already will have to meet those perpetual affordability requirements. Winston, Prouty, and others, as they accept, as I expect them to, say, community development block grant dollars, my department will layer on affordability requirements for those aspects of the project. Where it gets tricky is these are intended to be either infrastructure or something else that's going to serve the whole project. And so compliance with that would get tricky because I couldn't necessarily ensure right up front how much of, say, Prospect Heights is going to comply with perpetual affordability. Some may not.
It's the permanently that's
And-
triggered.
That is tricky.
Word permanently.
So we're the word permanently not there, that would no longer be objectionable?
He recommended some language.
I think it's affordable and permanent needs to
The
go.
language that the commissioner recommended
I'm sorry.
was affordability ought to be taken into consideration. So we'll work with our draft. We haven't discussed it with the whole committee yet.
Okay.
So, and our legal staff, we can work with our lawyer too, because we have to go through this language as a committee as well.
Sure. And while John isn't typically involved in the housing world, he has been pulled in a little bit
Right.
lately, so he knows a bit about AMIs and how we've structured this elsewhere.
And Kevin?
Back to how much of a delay would you expect if we go into the grant route instead of?
Say next spring.
Sure. So as currently drafted, you'd be looking at next spring at the earliest.
So that is if it goes through the process of having to come back to us.
That's right.
So you need to balance that.
That's right.
Gotcha.
And that's captured in the letter that was distributed to you all. I just wanted to make sure that you all had it in writing for reference.
So you may not be the person to answer this, and maybe more higher up. What was the criteria used to choose these 3 projects?
Mhm. So we assembled a list of, I'm not remembering the total number right now, 15 to 20 projects that had been on various other application lists, community development block grants, Northern Borders Regional Commission, the Regional Planning Commission's assembled priority list. So we grab projects from these various lists. Our internal, and it was a discussion really between ACCD and AOA, our internal criteria were, we wanted them to be housing oriented. We wanted to focus on communities impacted by floods. We wanted them to be sort of regional economic projects. So that was demonstrated with, I think, the 3 projects. And Nick, I'm forgetting, there's another one.
Madam Chair, if I might, Nick Kramer, COO of the Agency of Administration. For the record,
Oh,
we
yes.
talked about project readiness, I
Yeah.
think. We looked at how many other alternative non-state funding sources were already lined up for the project. We looked at community buy-in for
Yeah,
the project.
that's right.
Projects that had a large degree of community support and a diverse coalition of stakeholders driving them forward.
And some of that is reflected in here, in your project criteria.
Well, that's helpful.
Oh, and
We can pick up some of that.
Right.
And we just disagree on where the money is housed.
right,
It's a big disagreement. Because if you had 15 or 20 other projects that were sort of in the pipeline elsewhere,
Mhm.
it begs my concern of opening up the capital.
Mhm.
Once you do that, those projects are gonna be right before us.
Mhm.
We've been through that in the past.
Mhm.
And that's why we ended up having, granted, these were smaller projects, but that's why we ended up with the building community grants part.
Mhm.
Because we had what was called the deli section with all these projects, little projects coming in. And this is before anyone's time here. Mary was around, and let me tell you, it tied us up where we couldn't do our work for the regular pressures in our capital budget and was taking money away from other projects that were really needed on the state level.
Mhm.
And that's why we developed the building community grants. This is much bigger magnitude than those little projects. The other thing we've also experienced was when we did school construction. And we had a moratorium on school construction in the early 2000s. It lasted for 2 years. And we finally lifted the moratorium. We had those school districts knocking on our door that did construction during the moratorium wanting to be reimbursed.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's what you open up
Mhm.
when you put something like this in the capital.
Mhm.
And we're not saying we don't do it, just the capital bill is not the appropriate vehicle.
Right.
Because it's really gonna open up the door. And when you said there's 15 or 20 projects that were in the pipeline, there you go.
Mm.
That validates my argument.
Sure, and I did just want to be transparent that we did look at a long list of projects, not that they applied to this, but that we evaluated a long list and were thoughtful about what we chose. As for the rest of that, I defer to AOA.
And we could swap it.
You wanna go there?
I am reachable by email if I'm needed again, but thank you all.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you.
It's on It was a hot seat.
It's nice and warm, actually. My office chair up the 5th floor, it's so drafty, it's cold, you know.
Maybe we can put some capital dollars in there to help you.
Hey, I hear this committee has an appetite for chairs, right? Again, for the record, Nick Kramer, COO, AOA, good to see everybody. You don't see me, I see you a lot. So good to be back in the flesh. This committee has been busy. And I will keep my comments targeted to the matter at hand. I think, needless to say, the administration and the governor have some pretty serious concerns at this point about the state of the Capitol bill and the draft under discussion. Preview that there may be some commentary coming on that front. But since we're here to talk about the 3B projects, I think the commissioner did a great job overviewing. I would just fill in a couple pieces. He mentioned about the perpetual affordability criteria. And just one piece that he and I have discussed that I wanted to underscore there is a lot of times, especially these days, there's such a broad mix of housing development projects underway in Vermont. And there's been so much money poured into that area, that sector in recent years that a lot of communities, and I think several of the ones we were in here testifying, are finding that actually, depending on the community needs, there may be gaps in sort of all along the spectrum of affordability. And so some of our thinking too, which was exemplified in some of these projects, is just wanting to make sure that communities have the flexibility to decide what they think the gaps are. And I think the commissioner appropriately underscored, we're always thinking about affordability, and that's a top priority. It's just having it codified specifically in statute is limiting in a way that he described. So I just wanted to underscore that. Not that anybody's against affordability, but there's just a flexibility component. So I think in terms of the kind of high level overview, I mean, Commissioner Farrell said it, we're concerned about the reduction in funding. We're concerned about some of the timing issues with the current projects getting out. And if they have to stand up a grant program, and there will inevitably be delays, and time is money in the capital space. What I really wanted to come into the chair to speak to are just a couple technical pieces, as I want to do. My understanding is the committee's intention is to fund this out of Cash Fund B, right? So I want to just underscore for the committee, and I've talked to Scott about this, that per kind of current actions this committee has taken, there's $1 million sitting in Cash Fund B, right? Which the governor and the administration had proposed to move to Cash Fund A to fund our Cash Fund projects this year. The committee decided not to make that transfer. So that $1 million is still in Cash Fund B. If the proposal is to fund a $2 million grant program out of Cash Fund B, and there's $1 million sitting in there, there's $1 million of additional funding that's going to be needed to support that program. And so I've spoken with the chair about this. I just want to make sure the committee broadly has understanding that an additional action will have to be taken in order to fund this construct. And because fund transfers happen in the big bill, that additional action will have to be taken in the big bill. So this committee will communicate with their House counterparts if it's a transfer from another cash fund subaccount, a transfer directly from the general fund, there will have to be some action taken to support that. So I just wanted to state that on the record.
So the way we do that is working with our legal staff to draft language, and we're not at that point yet.
Right.
We haven't completed the draft here. We haven't completed working with John Gray. And that language, that's what we always figured would be happening. The other $1 million, if you remember correctly, was left over from the state colleges that we gave back to Appropriations Committee last year. And it was still there. The administration said, oh, we'll pull it into the capital bill. We decided to keep it over in subaccount B for the Appropriations Committee to use. So to link that 1 million with this 2 million, they're separate things. And I'm pretty sure that the Appropriations Committee has already accounted for that 1 million that was there in subaccount B.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Madam Chair. I mean, I think this is a perennial and recurring topic or kind of question point with governmental fund accounting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very often there's an action taken that reduces something, and then another action is taken to increase spending in something. And there's this tendency to want to link two actions like, oh, you're taking money from this. And that's not really how fund accounting works. To your point, there's a fund balance. I just mentioned that it was in there because of this action, but the fact is there is a current fund balance, unobligated fund balance of $1 million. So just for the committee's awareness. I will say, and I understand the kind of higher level jurisdictional perspectives that may be playing into the decision to fund out of the second subaccount. I will say, as I think I've said before, the second subaccount was not an administration's creation. That was a legislative creation in 2023. What I have personally observed is a pretty large degree of confusion around the second subaccount, particularly as it relates to that first subaccount, which has really always been our focus. And as you all know, kind of my personal rallying cry is strong investment in Cash Fund A. So we have a general concern about any action that moves other priorities, other projects into Cash Fund B and kind of muddies the waters, both logistically and operationally. It's difficult to track both sub-accounts. I think the repo committee this year has experienced that to some degree. There's a jurisdictional question. Is it a capital bill thing? Is it an appropriations thing? I understand this committee sort of taking the position that, well, there's a nexus to the capital bill, but cash fund B is really an appropriations thing. And I understand that. We just posit that there are other ways to take something out of the capital bill and put it in the appropriations world that aren't just cash fund B, right? Specifically, cash fund B, I think, has just been kind of a complicated construct. And so we have some general unease about that.
And those conversations really need to occur with the Appropriations Committee, because that's where the development of sub-account A and sub-account B came from. It came from the Senate Appropriations Committee two years ago.
Yep.
3 years ago,
2
3
years.
years ago, when it was first being established. And there was a lot of money floating around, particularly ARPA money, IIJA money, and we needed cash for we needed general fund dollars to match some of those items. And that's where sub-account was developed, sub-account B, to take care of other infrastructure and other needs. And that was the construct of the appropriations world, Appropriations Committee world. We didn't have any for that. And where that goes on out, I don't know, because those are conversations as well with Appropriations Committee, because that's their world, the sub-account B. That's their world.
Totally.
And it's all their world, because it's general fund dollars that go into cash fund account A and cash fund account B. So it's all part of the big bill, the big budget, as well as BAA at some points with the Appropriations Committee and the general fund. It's not our world.
I think there's a strong argument, Madam Chair, to be made even for that legislative construct, which you rightly point out was established because we had some one-time pandemic-driven and post-pandemic-driven federal funding. We knew we were going to have future match needs to draw down that federal funding over time. We needed a place, a parking lot, if you will, to stick it. I can't speak to all of the reasons that the Senate Appropriations Committee wanted to create that fund. I believe that's the committee it came out of, maybe others, but I think, and I don't want to speculate, but I do think, now that we're looking back at it with a couple years of experience under our belt, there's a very reasonable argument to be made that we had this one-time influx of funding. We established this mechanism to capture that funding, to hold it for future needs. We're very much exiting that era of pandemic funding, right? We're spending down the remainder of federal funds. Everybody in this room is probably aware of the current federal context. I think there's a strong argument to be made for maybe that fund kind of gets, it may have served its purpose. So I'll leave that there. I did have one other piece of technical feedback that I wanted to relay, and it's not particularly related to these 3B appropriations, but sort of cash fund generally. And I've been in here testifying about this before. I do think I had a conversation with the chair this morning about this. What I want to flag, we had this whole conversation about the language for the reallocation process for cash fund appropriations as opposed to bonded dollar appropriations. And I understand there's been an ongoing conversation about that. The committee is interested in getting some more experience and sort of seeing how things play out. What I want to just make sure is understood clearly by all members of this committee, and the chair has heard this and I think certainly appreciates this, is that under current law, on the 2-year anniversary of the FY 24-25 capital bill passage, which is sometime, I believe, late April or early May of this year, so in a couple weeks, basically, all of the FY 24 cash fund appropriations, that spending authority will expire and will freeze. And our financial operations director has told me, under current law, what he will have to legally do per the current language is freeze the spending authority on all of those cash fund appropriations. And then presumably what would happen is in next session, when the committee's back, the repo committee and other members of this committee would be interested in looking at, oh, wow, look, there's this whole list of FY 24 cash fund appropriations. Why hasn't the money gone out the door? Well, legally, under current statute, we have to freeze that spending authority on April, whatever, late April, early May of this year. So understanding that our proposal, which was to tie the cash fund reallocation process to the bonded dollar reallocation process, which we stand by, we think is a benign pairing of those two processes. Understanding that the committee may want to have a little bit more time to think about that and tease out some of the nuances. My request and the request on behalf of all departments, just from an operational perspective, would be that the committee please look at maybe even a temporary fix on just that current language piece, so that we don't have to freeze that spending 30 and we can keep spending.
Yeah, we need to try.
Can you just give me a sense of where that originated?
The language?
Yeah.
Folks.
According to the chair of the appropriations committee.
So in terms of the language, the 2-year,
Yeah, yeah.
it all came from appropriations committee.
House,
No,
Senate.
probably Senate, House and Senate. But as I said to Nick this morning, I said, I can understand why they did that because they deal in 1-year budget cycles.
Yeah.
So for them, at the end of a 2-year budget cycle, and this was a recommend for language that came, I was trying to find it. Did it come through? It was originally from what the administration proposed on the BAA. I think it was
This
originally
current
proposed
year,
on this current
correct.
budget, general fund budget, BAA, where we take over the reallocations. And then they also wanted clarity in terms of when does that clock really start ticking in terms of the 2-year thing? And what the language, so they wanted to address that. And we didn't, we said no. And I'm recalling what the actual language in the law says is that if there's unspent money and it's from, there was misinterpretation in terms of when the clock started ticking. But at the end, it said after 2 years, any unspent money goes back to the cash fund, I believe.
So
So the question is, when does it start ticking? And then what happens at the end of that 2 years? And what you're saying, at the end of that 2 years, the interpretation of when it started ticking is when the legislation was passed.
So I think there's two issues, Madam Chair. One of them rightly said is defining specifically when that clock starts ticking. That would be great to have clarity on that. But then the other, and I would say almost more significant issue is the way the language is written currently. And I'm going to paraphrase probably poorly, which is always dangerous with statute, but it says something like shall have 2 years from this ticking clock that we have to define to expend the funds. And then, like you say, all remaining spending authority shall revert to the fund or something like that. And the issue there, which is why we brought this up in the BAA and why we proposed tying it to the bonded dollars, is that's a very different process than what happens with bonded appropriations. With bonded appropriations, capital appropriations, historically, what happens is there is a ticking clock. There is a clock an alarm bell that goes off at 2 years, whereby the repo committee and this committee and the administration, for that matter, start scrutinizing really closely. Why hasn't money gone out after 2 years? What's different with the cash fund is it's saying, if you haven't encumbered or obligated that funding, which has a very specific narrow definition in terms of our financial system, by 2 years, that's it. The opportunity to do that is over. And the issue based on the timing of the ticking clock is that's likely to happen towards the end of a legislative session and completely preclude the possibility of that entire construction season.
And is it encumbered or expend? Because
Unspent. I think it says.
It may be unspent, which would be even,
I'd like to get, do you have the reference for the statute?
I think it's 32 VSA 1001B. I can't do this.
1001, because I know I have it, I know we talked about, it, and I know there was some language that had been proposed to take care, because we worked, and I'm trying to find it, because it was with the general fund BAA.
Madam Chair. And
We
then,
worked with joint fiscal office, and there was some and I know there was some language that was put in. I remember seeing a draft with language that kind of clarified.
my
And
request, Madam Chair, would just be that it stay on the committee's radar and
But we can make some recommendations. We can
That'd be great.
change that language possibly in the capital bill and let our appropriations committee know. James,
Well, I was just gonna say that
I know we haven't.
I think that it would be, we probably want more time to make a permanent decision, but having language that gives like a year. So that we have the rest of the session into next session to make, a more prudent and thoughtful decision would be good, extension, so to speak, so give us that extra year, so we can work on it. That's all I have to say.
We just need to clarify when the clock starts ticking. And then at the end, and I'm gonna look at my
That's right, Representative. So it's subsection E of 1001B in Title 32. And what it says currently is spending authority. Any entity authorized to make expenditures from the capital infrastructure subaccount, Cash Fund A, shall have not more than 2 years from the legislative session in which the act authorizing the expenditure was enacted to encumber the funds.
To encumber.
Any remaining unencumbered funds shall remain part of the fund account.
And you're saying the clock starts ticking in April?
Well, so I think one point of clarification that's needed is what does not more than 2 years from the
Yeah.
legislative session in which the act, because if you could interpret that as the last day of the regular legislative session, the last day of a veto session. I think the reason I said April, Madam Chair, is at some point you and I had a conversation about, oh, well, it should be 2 years from the passage of the capital bill. Sometimes that's at the very, very tail end of April.
Passage means it's enacted.
Right.
I think the interpretation that the legislative end had is when the governor actually signs it and it kicks into place, which is usually in June.
So regardless, that clarification would be great. And then the piece that I'm highlighting as particularly problematic is this: any remaining unencumbered funds shall remain part of the fund account. So if funds aren't encumbered, which again has a very specific definition for us in terms of our financial system, with just since we're talking about it, I'll flesh out. So if a department, say, has an agreement and a project underway and a plan in place and design may be finished and they're planning to use funds for a specific project, that doesn't mean encumbered, unfortunately. There's a very specific, they have to create a PO, a purchase order in the Vision financial system, and then they're considered encumbered. So this would mean that a lot of projects for which we have plans and for which we're moving forward, and maybe for that entire construction season, which could be the entirety of a project, because they're not officially encumbered, that spending authority would disappear. So our preference would be to parity in whether it's referencing the exact statute for bonding or not, some kind of parity so that we can continue those projects throughout that year. And then next year, when we are doing our capital budget development and then the legislature is doing their capital budget development, there would be scrutiny applied to those projects.
So you're not opposed to mirroring what we do with bonded dollars?
No, that was our proposal.
Okay.
That was their proposal.
Not
Fair
opposed.
point, fair point.
I just think.
But they wanted us to have control of the cash.
Thank you guys.
for the reallocations, and we've said, let that play out for a while because there's volatility so much in the finance world within the appropriations world. And also, it's only 2 years old, and let's start playing this out to see how really those reallocations do. Where does it lie? How is the process? And as we went through our capital bill this year and the session progresses, we've ended up reallocating some of those dollars because some of those dollars are connected to projects that also have bonded dollars that maybe are not going forward as much. And there was one project that they're not doing at all, and it was done by cash. And we asked the question when we were doing markup, and it's like, oh, there's 200,000 for the stack area. We're not going to go forward and do it. We didn't ask the question. Nobody would have told us. And the 200,000 in cash would be sitting there.
So I think, Madam Chair, what we're discussing here and a potential language tweak certainly wouldn't preclude exactly what you're describing, right? Which is just continual reevaluation. I mean, I noted this committee made some reallocations, even in the bonded space, from last year's capital bill, right? Which is not contemplated in statute, certainly within the purview of the committee to do that. Somewhat atypical, right? And I'm going to take this opportunity just to make one comment about, because I hear this a lot in this committee, this issue of cash flow and this issue of, well, we have to look at what's going out the door and make sure new projects are, this reprioritization, which I think justifies 85–90% of the amendments this committee makes. I just want to offer the perspective that certainly there are projects, and this happens within our capital budget process, where for a specific project-oriented reason, something is not moving forward. And then in that case, yes, sometimes it makes sense to reallocate, to reprioritize, to shift things around. But I think that there are some macro things happening in the capital space right now, in the construction sector generally, which I think we've been in here testifying about, which is there's so many projects that are going out the door, a lot of them driven by a lot of this pandemic federal funding that we've had. And there's a real bottleneck in terms of the construction industry and the ability to get projects out the door. So there's a limit on the sort of contracting universe of people to do these projects. We have internal capacity limits within the state perennially. And so there may be macro reasons that projects are not moving forward as quickly as we would have liked. That's evidenced by the amount of authorized but unissued debt that we have outstanding. So if this committee or the administration or anyone generally makes a decision to reprioritize, say, oh, this project's not going out the door, let's put it to this other project, that doesn't necessarily solve those macro problems, right? And those other projects may run into that same thing. And when we may be back in here in 2 years looking at those new reallocations being like, why isn't this getting out the door? Let's move it to something else, right? And in the meantime, nothing is getting done. So we actually share, I think, the committee's perspective and frustration. Certainly this came up in the governor's budget development of looking at the universe and being like, man, it would be really great if more progress had happened here, here, and here, and here. But our feeling, and one of the reasons I think you see a lot of projects that have additional funding for projects that may not have seen a significant amount of progress yet, is this is a space in which things take a lot of time. There's a lot of planning. And yes, we can make reprioritizations and move money around, but it doesn't necessarily fix that problem. And in some cases may exacerbate it. So I'm not commenting on any particular projects at this point, but I just want to make that comment for the committee's awareness, right? There are some big things happening in this space and we can move around the edges, and sometimes that's completely appropriate. And sometimes it's a matter of personal or political priorities. And we certainly understand that, but writ large, there are issues in the capital bill space that just mean that there is this backlog and there is this pipeline. And in some cases, our feeling is the best thing we can do is just devote resources and really push forward, try to keep the lights on, try to keep things moving forward. Oftentimes, I'm always smile to see when this committee will make reallocations of projects that this committee introduced or prioritized in recent years, right? So we certainly understand it's a dynamic process, but just wanted to offer that reflection.
And I appreciate that. And that's what we do as legislators. Our due diligence is we're responsible for taxpayer dollars. And we know these projects are going to take a long time. We fully understand what's happening with supply chains, with contractors. That's why we keep asking those questions. When are you proposing to go out with an RFP? When are you going to get your construction started? When is this? And if it's going to be in 26, at the end of 26, you're already out to FY 27 in terms of budgeting. That's what we balance. And it's not that we're going to stop projects, but we want to make sure that our dollars are out there in a timely manner. And that's why we've gone back and pulled some money from some of the projects, because they're not going to be moving as quickly as we had hoped. And it keeps getting bumped out, not from the actions we've taken, but because of the world out there. And we're saying, well, let's nip it here a couple 100,000 or $1 million because you still haven't gone out to bids with this. And that's the balancing act that we do. And that's why we, as members of the committee, ask these questions to really find out where the flow of these dollars. Doesn't mean we don't support a project. but we're doing our due diligence to protect our Vermont taxpayers.
And to piggyback on the chair, that's where the other question always is. What projects do you have that can go out? And so when we're hearing testimony that, yes, project A may be a year out. But we do have project B and we believe we can get them out the door. Like, if there was two projects that aren't going out till next year, well, it doesn't make any sense to change them. But if the testimony is, we think we can get this one done, this is a different, it's a different, whatever parameters, then that's what we'll make a move. Not that every move is gonna be right. Not that every move on that side is right. We're always gonna make mistakes, right? But that's the process, you know that already, but that's the process. It's like not just willy-nilly. Asking all those questions of, well, okay, you can't do this right now, but what can you do? And at the end of the day, is it kind of like throwing darts at a dartboard and hoping? Probably, but there's some science to it, I suppose.
Yeah, thank
Your
you,
point's taken.
Representative. I completely agree. No, and I think, I'm often struck by the parallels in the jobs that we all have, right? We go through the same process, just at different times, and very legitimately, often there's new information that's known in January, February, and March that wasn't known at the time we were doing capital budget development. So I just want to state for the record, we fully appreciate all of those very legitimate reasons there might be tweaks, and they're certainly representative of our projects occasionally where, oh yeah, there's a specific equipment delay or something, and this is not moving forward, right? And this other one, we've got contractors lined up, and so that certainly happens. I just wanted, since I'm in my favorite seat in the building, to take the opportunity to just make the general comment that I think what we see is that sometimes even those projects that seem like, oh yeah, this is ready to go forward. There's so much dynamism in this space right now, and there's so much uncertainty that sometimes what we might be in here, speaking of information changing, or somebody might testify, say, yeah, we really think this is ready. Well, it turns out some of these macro sector specific, sector wide issues delay that project as well, right? So moving projects can be challenging, but I think these are all points we all appreciate and understand, but I, as always, love the opportunity to speak with you. Appreciate you having me. Happy to answer any other questions while I'm here, or I can vacate and let you get on with the good work.
Questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment, or I guess it's more of a question to you, is, so with the cash issue, I don't know that as a group, we're ready to make a decision on a permanent change, but I mean, is there, other than making a temporary, like an extension for a year or something like that, that gives us time, what are
You
our
mean to
other?
reallocate where it starts
Yeah,
at 2
yeah,
years?
because
We'll
even if it's,
figure
whether
it
it's
out.
late April or early June, that's still not a lot of time. So, it is new. I'm not prepared to make a permanent change. I think it's too early in the thing, but I would like to have more time to be able to have us do, like I said, more thoughtful look at this. But I also don't want the issue of whether it's June or April 28th. It doesn't matter to me what day it is, having that money freeze and we're like, oh, all right. So I guess that was my question to you.
Yeah. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess this is more of a question for going back to the 3Bs and the grants. And I guess my question is, can we come up with a little different scenario somehow? I understand your side, we have our side.
But they gave suggestions to the language.
Right.
They support the bulk of the language, but there
Not
needs
for
to be
these three,
some
though.
tweaks.
The grant program would be.
Well,
in
they don't
place
want the grant program because it's
in
gonna
the Future, not for these three.
Right.
It wouldn't apply. They're asking for it to not apply.
apply to the other projects.
I think our perspective on that, which I think Alex spoke to well, is just that these have been through a process of evaluation against other projects. I understand the committee's position. I don't want to reopen the whole discussion. We had to reach out to the communities at some point. They were in here testifying, right? There's there's some momentum here. And I think understanding the committee's concern moving forward, which is one of the reasons we want why philosophically, I mean, I don't think anybody's opposed to the idea of a competitive grant program moving forward. I think it's a great idea. We all agree that the housing space needs infrastructure, right? So I think that's where that's coming from. Our feeling is just like, well, there's progress made on these projects. As I was saying, one of the criteria that we looked at was project readiness and the ability to get these funds out the door, and all of the units that they'll generate, the child care centers, slots in one case. We just feel like these are really primed and ready, and understanding there's a larger legislative discussion and concern. We'd love to see these projects be able to move forward, not be tied up in the stand up of a new grant program, a check back of whatever form that takes. And just to have that opportunity to really keep that momentum going. And then certainly happy to have the ongoing discussion, representative, about a grant program or whatever that looks like moving forward, and whether it lives here or in the appropriations committee or what. I think our feeling is, look, it would be a missed opportunity. We have this all teed up and ready to go. These great projects with these huge benefits, they were vetted against a whole universe of other projects. Let's just get these out the door and then have a larger conversation. So that's our perspective, I'd say.
Thanks for the clarity.
So there's also another piece to all of this we haven't spoken about. And it was the governor's proposal of the infrastructure fund,
Yeah.
which is in the housing bill that is working through a House, and I'm assuming it's in the housing bill that came out of the Senate. And it is to set up an infrastructure fund to go towards these projects that our 2 million is proposed to go to. It's to build that infrastructure of water and sewer, transportation, roads, whatever it may be, from where the lines of your water and sewer lines are. It's that hookup from that line to the development. That is the governor's proposal within the housing bill, and that is there, and that's going to take a year or two to set up. So that's where these projects will go.
So, Madam Chair, I appreciate that. And I'm really glad that the committee is looking at more broadly the housing proposal. I think that's something we've spoken to before. You know, things change every day time of year, so my information may not be current. I believe your appropriations counterparts just made proposing some pretty serious reductions to that fund. So that's something for this committee to be aware of, that, you know, in this space, there are pieces moving, pieces shifting. I think we remain committed to the proposal that that one program, I think, there's not perfect overlap between the criteria for that revolving fund that you're describing, Madam Chair, and these projects. These projects, part of the reason we were excited to move them forward in the capital bill was there was some flexibility there to use for specific things. As you heard in testimony, it's not all the exact same pieces of infrastructure. So yes, there are other opportunities. There are other funds moving in this space. Thank goodness, right? Because we have a serious housing crisis in the state. We need all the dollars we can get. And I think we're concerned to watch as those reductions start to be made in the legislative operating budget process. So more than ever, it feels to us, we need these dollars to move forward.
Yeah, I think just recapping where we're at right now, you know, and this is as much a committee as you, Nick. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing it, that I sort of feel like these proposals were hanging by a thread when they got here, you know. And they were because, you know, for the reasons the chair said, it's changing the nature of the capital bill and setting a precedent that we're not quite comfortable with having individual communities come and make their case for this. So the language was really like explicitly intended not to be in the green books and be ongoing, but was really sort of trying to, you know, move some mountains to accommodate these requests. Because I think we agree with, you know, it too, you know, but, you know, I guess the question, Nick, is if it's through a process like this or nothing, you know, what's the preference from the administration? I hate to give you that choice, but we got to vote soon on this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope, Representative, that that's not the dichotomy that this committee would set up for itself, like our process or nothing. I mean, the short answer is we feel like these projects, as we've testified multiple times, are super important, super critical, and are ready to go. Our hope is that they can move forward. If we've articulated, I think Commissioner Farrell just spent some time talking about specific language issues we have with the language as drafted. I think we're open to continued discussion if there can be tweaks to this language that address some of those concerns. Notwithstanding all that, I think unless there are significant tweaks, some of those timing concerns about these projects are going to stand, right? And I would invite the committee to contemplate. So if part of this discussion is drafting a set of criteria for a grant program that align with the criteria that the administration and the governor's team went through to identify these projects, what is the value add in this current year of doing that, right? If we're just codifying what we've already done with these projects and we go through a competitive grant process, let's say we get a similar universe of projects to consider as we stand that up that we did consider originally, these 3 projects are selected, right? Or some subset of them. How much value did that particular piece really add, I guess would be my question. So our feeling is we have these projects, again, I hate to sound like a broken record on this, but they're ready, they're great, they have these huge community benefits moving forward. Let's push them forward and then have a larger conversation about an ongoing grant program. Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm also cognizant of the committee's time. I know I've been here for a while.
Any other questions, comments?
I think the only question I would have is how closely did you really follow these projects?
I mean, Representative
And
Reed,
were you down there? Was Mr. Farrell down in our community? Have you seen the project? Have you seen it flip and change numerous times since you even proposed this?
we've followed the projects, Representative. I mean, I can't speak to Commissioner Farrell and his team and whether they've been down there. I appreciate your point, right? Which is that there's often changes and dynamism in any project and always open to, if you've got perspective to share, you'd like to communicate
Well, I
about
would
them.
have thought that the administration would have probably talked with even the legislative group in our communities to see what the real feel is in our communities and how things have changed dramatically. We've been told for probably the last year and a half or better that the shovels in the ground on certain dates. Lost that, and then all of a sudden we were getting grant money for something else that wasn't even discussed originally or relative to the project. It's almost like pulling money from numerous sources to create this program or this project. So it is concerning to me. I love my community. I want the best. I want housing. But we have been flipping this like a pancake for several years now. And the building's been, they couldn't even answer the questions about even the cost. I was, just even hearing from like the Berry project, the cost of what their housing was. I want this done right and affordable, but the numbers that keep adding up for our local project are just, they seem to change every time we turn around. So I would like to have had boots on the ground in our community, talking with people, seeing the project and moving forward in a positive way. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And that's where you hear my passion. You can be on a phone talking to anyone and being told it's the greatest project since grandma's apple pie, but this has a lot of complexities. And where we've seen some challenges with some other projects within the community that have not fulfilled what originally they were to be. That's my concern. I want our dollars to go to something that's actually going to provide something real good for our community.
Understood, Representative. Really appreciate those points. I mean, you and me both, right? These are passions we all share. I appreciate you surfacing those, and I think we're always open to communication. In terms of boots on the ground, the governor and the entire cabinet and team travel around for capital.
Well, they haven't been in Bennington in several years.
Coming soon, I would imagine then in that case.
Right,
So-
after the fact.
And I just
And I'm
wanted to,
sorry that first of all, let me back up. I apologize for you having to take my my frustration. I do apologize for that.
And that's part of my job, Representative. So no worries. Appreciate your frustrations. Would certainly invite further conversation about this. I did just want to clarify in terms of the development of the bill and these processes. Obviously, there's a lot that happens during the governor's budget development process with everything that we can't talk to anybody. I can't even go home and talk to my wife about, right? There's sort of this cone of executive privilege as we develop a budget. So we can't be reaching out specifically to legislators or even community members in some cases about certain things. So there are some nuances to tread there. But moving forward and generally, I think the door is certainly always open for conversation.
Well, I'm confused because you just said you talked to community and this is, will embrace this whole project.
Right.
Now you're saying you couldn't speak to community members, so which is it?
So I don't want to take too much of the committee's time, but logistically, right, as we develop the budget and decisions are being made, there's a space of executive privilege where we don't workshop things. There's sort of an internal process. Once decisions are made, to that point, we did, of course, have to reach out to the communities to say, hey, like these are projects are being considered. Make sure that it's on their awareness. We didn't want to be awarding money to somebody who couldn't take it, right? So there's some nuances in the timing for sure, but I think it's a little of both. And I hear your frustrations, and I really do appreciate you surfacing that.
Other questions, comments before we finish up?
Real straightforward bottom line. If Bennington doesn't get the $1 million, is it gonna die or is it somebody gonna find another $1 million?
I would defer to the project managers on that, Representative. What I recall from the testimony I think this committee heard is that without that $1 million, there would be some significant challenges getting over the finish line. I mean, I think what the gentleman on the screen had said was, nobody can say, because none of us have a crystal ball moving forward, that there wouldn't be a way to patch that project. It's not known to anybody, I think, at this point. I think they are pretty reliant on that $1 million to get across the finish line. So at minimum, it would be a significant project setback. To the representative's point, there's been a lot of change in that project, a lot of movement. So who knows? But I think that's the current state.
Yeah. So does the $1 million, did that include the Meals on Wheels program that the governor himself had in his speech when he was presenting the budget that all of a sudden then disappeared 3 weeks later? They're not doing it, part of it. And they had a number plugged into that was way off the charts, that our even Meals on Wheels folks said that wasn't what was the proposal for that piece alone.
When you say they, Representative, you mean the project managers?
The project manager.
Well, so I think in the interest of time and in the interest of committee, scrutiny, I would defer to the project team on the specific questions of what has changed. To your point, I'm not in Bennington every day and I'm not intimately involved with those project details. I think the proposal that we put forward was in alignment with where the project was at that point in time. And if there have been subsequent changes, I think that's probably a more appropriate question for the project management team itself. So I'll leave it there.
Well, once again, the project team being virtually almost one person and then some folks within our town office have had that opportunity in looking at what this is going to be. And they had said numerous times they were coming before our select board. I mean, this has, like I said, flipped so many times. That's my concern with it, that we may not be project and probably likely are not project ready. This is being fairly glued together. And I want a project that's going to work for my community as anyone else in this room, if they were in the same situation, would want that.
Heard loud and clear.
So I think you've heard some of the inks that we've had as a committee and what we're balancing. We did not zero out this. We did not zero it out. There were conversations about zeroing it out, and some members would be very comfortable with zeroing it out, and other members would not be comfortable. So we found a middle ground of $2 million. And there was a lot of concern from the committee as a whole of opening up the capital bill to future projects like this. We also know that that infrastructure fund, however, whatever happens to it as it goes through the process, but that was a governor's proposal. And that is part of this picture in the long term. So we're balancing that as well. We need to move on because I want to take a quick 5-minute break because we have something else, but we'll look at the language. Again, as I said, this is the first draft of this language. We haven't walked through it so much with our legal counsel. We need to do that. I appreciate your recommendations about the permanently affordable housing piece, the flexibility of report back when those dollars are triggered. We understand what you're saying about not wanting to establish a grant program, but we need some triggers in terms of when those dollars are released. And it helped that you had put down, listed what the criteria was when you made the decision of these 3 projects out of about 15 or 20 that are in the pipeline. And we take that in consideration. And then also for the cash fund in terms of the ticking clock, we'll try to address that as well.
Thank you,
Anything else?
as always, for your time.